Revolution, a chorus you would hear in the streets of France in the late 18th century. Get ready to jump back in time to the French Revolution and join me as I count down our top 10 list of unusual things that happened during the French Revolution. I'm your host Raechel Fisher, welcome back to the Hive, let's count it down. Number 10, the cutting edge. So I feel like I have to start here because this really was the prima donna of the revolution. One of the reasons the French Revolution became such a bloody event was due to the guillotine. It became the primary symbol of the French Revolution as the peasants exacted revenge on the aristocracy. It became known as the National Razor and Madame la Guillotine. Prior to the events of the revolution, executions were much more violent and cruel, if you can believe that. One involved quartering, which we won't get into, but you can imagine how bad that is if you take that literally. But Dr. Joseph Guillotine, a member of the French National Assembly, argued that there should be a painless and private capital punishment, and even argued against capital punishment in general. He didn't want it to happen. So Dr. Guillotine, along with a German and a harpsichord maker, Tobias Schmidt, invented the first prototype for the death machine. From there, the rest was history. It is estimated over 40,000 people were executed à la razor during the Reign of Terror. Pretty bad for a guy who really didn't want it to happen, but hey, at least it was painless. If the blade was sharp. If it wasn't, ugh. Number 9, the National Anthem. You know what's funny about going to theater school is that the more you learn, the more your teachers are like, hey, if something bad happens to you, you can use it, it's fuel for your art. Which is immediately what I thought of when I heard this story. Which is why, to me, it kind of makes sense that the origins of the French National Anthem happened during the French Revolution. They used their pain to make something good. Going through something dramatic? Sing about it. The monarchies of Europe were pretty pissed about the fact that they were killing a bunch of their friends and loved ones, so they formed a coalition to defeat the resistance and restore the monarchy. The French Baron Philippe Friedrich Dietrich requested that Roger de Lisle, another French officer, compose a song that would rally the troops. So he wrote the first anthem, called Chant de guerre pour l'armée de Rhin, which translates to War for the Army of Rhin. Volunteers carried the anthem all through the streets of Paris as they marched on the capital. The song title got subbed out for the simpler one called the Marseillaise, which became the Republic's anthem in 1795. And now, even today, it is the national anthem of France. Number 8, the tennis court oath. You'd think it would be like at a pub or on the street. Why I think that, I don't know, but it wasn't. One of the earliest acts of defiance in the French Revolution took place on a tennis court of all places. To say that Louis XVI was ill-equipped to handle the financial debt that his father and his grandfather built prior to his reign is kind of, well, it's an understatement. He had no clue. He made a desperate attempt in 1789 to address the economic issues by assembling the Estates Generales. It was a national assembly with 3 factions, each one representing either the nobles, the clergy, and the commoners. The third estates, which is the commoners, had the most members and declared themselves the National Assembly. There was a long list of overdue grievances, and they declared that they would force a new constitution on the king. Initially things were looking up as Louis legalized the assembly, but he locked them out of the damn meeting. So they moved to an indoor tennis court and took an oath to never disband until a new written constitution was formed for France. But very soon after that they stormed the Bastille. But we'll get to the Bastille later. Number 7, give us bread! The French Revolution very much erupted due to the financial distress of the people, but the tipping point was the moment bread became unattainable to the common Parisian. Bread is a huge thing in France, and it was a huge kind of staple meal for every Parisian. Marie Antoinette's famous misquoted response to the people asking for bread was, "Let them eat cake." Though it's debated whether she actually said that, it does summarize this yeasty flashpoint in history. They should have known better. In 1529, riots over grain and the Great Rebellion led to thousands of peasants destroying houses of the rich, all in the name of grain. But they didn't listen to their history, they made it worse. The king was counseled by the physiocrats since the 1760s, who firmly believed that the wealth of the nation was derived solely from the value of the land. Therefore, agricultural products should be highly priced. So they tried to intermittently deregulate the domestic trade to introduce free trade, but needless to say, they failed so hard. They caused food shortages and skyrocketed prices, which erupted in the Flour War over 300 riots to pillage grain in 1775. Layers and layers of tensions were added, along with other economic distress and all this stuff, added to the fuel of the blaze that would be later the French Revolution. Number 6. Flip a coin. Now, the royal family obviously didn't go willingly to their deaths. They at first tried to escape. As I previously mentioned, bread was a big deal, and on October 5th, 1789, a large crowd of mostly women began to assemble at the markets. Why were they there? To discuss the steep price of bread. But they were dismissed, so they marched from Paris to the Palace of Versailles and stormed the place. They took out several guards and chanted over and over to the king, "Live among the people." Louis conceded, he said yeah okay, and agreed to go with them to Paris. Agreed, kind of. But meanwhile, the royal family was placed under protection, and on the night of June 1971, the nobles dressed as their servants and their servants dressed as them, and the nobles made an attempt to escape to Austria. Now, if it were 2021, the king would probably have some arrogant social media so everyone would know what he looked like, but the commoners outside didn't. They had no pictures of him, so it was the perfect disguise. But his face was on every coin in France, and it was because of this he was recognized at the border and sent back. Now we know what happened next. Number 5. Last words. While she was alive, Marie Antoinette was abhorred, absolutely detested, they hated her. But funny enough, today she's incredibly well loved. Historians believe that due to rumors and hatred of the time, her character was misinterpreted. What do I think? Well, she was the product of the aristocracy that pretty much poisoned their own well. She was a bystander. But one of the moments that leads people to believe in her kinder nature was her last words. As Marie Antoinette walked up to the guillotine on October 16, 1793, she stepped on the foot of her executioner by accident. Some say it was something else, but either way, her last words were reported as, "I'm sorry." Number 4. The Bastille. Bastille, Bastille, Bastille. What am I talking about? It seems wrong not to mention one of the most pivotal moments in the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. Peasants rose up and literally stormed the most famous prison in France. But what you may not know is that they destroyed that building with their own bare hands. They tore it brick from brick because they didn't have any explosives. The Bastille was a fearsome 100 feet high, 8-towered prison that became a symbol for the tyranny of the aristocrats. So it was only natural that they would take out their anger on this place. At dawn on July 14th, a crowd armed with only muskets, swords, makeshift weapons gathered around the Bastille. Their intent was to demand the ammunition stored there from the governor of the prison, the Marquis de Lanay. He and his men were eventually overwhelmed and the people stormed it. Lanay raised a white flag and surrendered. He and his men were taken into custody, gunpowder and cannons were seized, and 7 prisoners were freed. Lanay was destroyed by the mob before he even met trial. This pivotal moment in history is celebrated as the French national holiday, even today. Number 3. Charlotte Corday, assassin of Marat. So we have established a couple things. One is that the French Revolution was bloody, relentless, and pretty terrifying. As much as it proved the statement that people shouldn't be afraid of their governments, but the other way around, Alan Moore, V for Vendetta, it wasn't a great place to be. Enter Charlotte Corday. Charlotte was a passionate supporter of the revolution, even though its main conspirators were set on killing the likes of her. Charlotte was, after all, a noblewoman, though she opposed the reign of terror. There were two sides to the fray, the Girondists and the Jacobins, and Charlotte fought alongside the first, the Girondists. But the Jacobins were radical and tried to kill any and all oppositionists, the Girondists included, which is why Charlotte decided that Jean-Paul Marat, leader of the Jacobins, had to be taken out. She became an assassin. While Marat was taking a bath, Charlotte stormed in. She'd bought a knife and, disguised as an informant, went in to speak with him. She said she had news. At first, she delivered on her offer and told him of the escaped Girondists. He at once said that they would be guillotined, and so she whipped out her knife and popped his bath bubbles for good. Corday knew she was going to be caught, however, and had told no one, not even her family, her plan, so they wouldn't stop her. Charlotte was guillotined July 17, 1793 with her name attached to her dress so she would be recognized. She wrote in a letter explaining her actions, "I desire only that my head, carried through Paris, may be a rallying standard for all the friends of the law." Number 2. Public zoo! Did you know that in the middle of all that crazy turmoil and public executions, they managed to find time to open a public zoo? In 1793, the National Assembly declared that all privately owned exotic animals will be transferred to the menagerie at the Palace of Versailles, or killed, stuffed, and donated to scientists. Gladly though, the animals' lives were spared and the menagerie was reopened as a zoo. It was free to the public and peasants got to go see exotic animals for the first time. Jacques-Henri Bernardin de Saint-Pierre Robespierre, the founder, passionately believed that the public should be educated about exotic animals. Now, I can't be sure how well the animals were treated, I assume it wasn't very great, but this was technically the first zoo. Number 1. Maximillian Robespierre. Now, it only seems fitting that we end this list at the end. Maximillian Robespierre started out with good intentions, but even though the revolution was about the dismantling of power, Maximillian became corrupted by it. Yes, he did topple the monarchy and put the power back to the people, but then he took it back for himself and got a little crazy, you know, the whole thing. Robespierre worked as a lawyer in France and focused a lot of his cases towards the underprivileged classes. This got him a lot of popularity, and he eventually rose to be the poster child of the revolution, the leader of the revolution. He became the head of public safety after Louis and Marie lost their heads, and continued to accuse many members of the National Convention of treasonous and unrevolutionary activities all over the place. Remember the whole thing between the Girondists and the Jacobins? This was that. In less than a year, 300,000 people were arrested, 10,000 died in prison, and 17,000 were guillotined. I think those numbers might be slightly off, but that's kind of what the research said. One by one, he set them all to the guillotine until he eventually was elected the president of the National Convention. Within 6 days, he passed a law that suspended the right to a public trial and to legal assistance, and by the end of that month, 1,400 were guillotined. Talk about trigger happy. Finally, the right and the left had to reunite in order to overthrow him, and he was eventually met the blade himself. Kind of crazy how full circle that is. And that was our juicy history list for today. If you want more like this, let me know in the comments. You know I love this stuff. And remember to comment and subscribe to stay a part of the Hive. I've been your host, Raechel Fisher. If you're so inclined, check me out on Instagram at Raechel Fisher 411. Until next time, stay sweet bees.